and I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you for joining. I suppose I maybe have the short straw. It's quite an early morning where I am, but I hope you've been having a good day. So we've heard a lot about why financial institutions, investment portfolios can think about disclosing and measuring emissions. I have a few slides to talk about what they are, and it's pretty high level. So let's get started. On the next one, we have an overview of the greenhouse gas protocol. And this is many decades old now. It predates the Kyoto COP, so COP3 back in 1990s. And it sets out a number of scopes of emissions, 3 scopes of emissions. Now, scope 1 is direct. Scope 2, indirect, while manufacturing, and then scope 3, the value chain. So for a normal company, and let's say my favorite example, a car manufacturer, the direct emissions will be while manufacturing, so scope 1. Scope 2 will be the energy used while making the car, which is scope 2, so indirect. And then scope 3 is the moment the car is taken away from the garage forecourt and then driven. This means for the financial industry, as Monica said, the majority of the emissions are in those downstream activities, the scope 3. And for the financial industry, the scope 3 emissions are made up of the companies in the portfolio, and a pro rata is completed to take the share for the particular financial institution, looking at the debt or equity holdings or lending that they have the exposure. So the scope 3 for an investment portfolio is made up of the scope 1 and 2, the portfolio companies, and a pro rata completed. Just one other point to note here, in the EU, by 2025, there will also be a requirement via the EU taxonomy that investment portfolios, financial institutions include their scope 3 of their portfolio companies in that downward value chain emissions. So this will be extending over time. Now going on to TCFD and one of the uses of those emissions. And TCFD came about in 2017. It's a set of disclosures. It applies to all different industries. And there's an example on the next page. It's now being implemented by a number of multinationals, and a number of regulations are also starting to include aspects of TCFD. When I think about TCFD, I really think about a bit of a Venn diagram. So firstly, there's the requirements themselves and the carbon emissions, which underpin a lot of the analysis. There's then setting targets and SBTI, so the Science-Based Targets Initiative, as a result of those carbon emissions and the impact that climate change may have on an organisation. And there's also other areas such as governance and strategy. So there's the quantitative information, there's the qualitative information, and then there's target settings and initiatives. And as much as possible, it's about trying to bring those things together so there's a really solid base for TCFD reporting. On the next slide, go into a little bit more detail on TCFD and the different areas. And just to dive into really what this is and risk management. So the question that TCFD is asking is, what is the impact of climate on you as an organisation? So it's not the other way around. So these impacts, transition risks, physical risks. So transition risks could be related to swift policy change, or even limited policy change on climate action. Physical risks could be more severe weather and climate. These things will happen. Many are baked in already. We don't have a choice as a planet anymore. So the question TCFD asks is, what will those impacts which are happening externally have on me as an organisation? And it asks a number of what if questions. So run some scenarios. And what will happen? What if these things play out? So from a risk management piece, it's looking at these climate risks, and then the metrics and targets is underpinned by the carbon emissions, but also those scenarios. TCFD is quickly moving to mandatory. It will very likely be included in IFRS and accounting soon. At the G7, the finance ministers indicated that it will be mandatory in those countries. And it's also supported by the stock exchanges, for example, in Indonesia and Malaysia for the companies that list there. It's underpins and part of the thinking in the Singapore stress test for the banking system, and in Japan, this is moving to mandatory quite quickly too. So lots of compelling reasons to look at it. And then the final slide is looking at a type of implementation plan and some examples of where South Pole can help. And really, the work on TCFD starts with understanding the practices today. Some of this will already be going on in organisations, for example, on governance. Look at the TCFD recommendations and perform a gap analysis. So that's usually a starting point. There's then also workshops and education and raising awareness inside an organisation as part of this journey. Then having some form of plan, an evolving plan. It expands, it evolves over time, and then the reporting. So these are just some of the steps with TCFD reporting. But enough about carbon emissions and what TCFD is. I'll now hand over to someone who's done it in practice. So over to you, Tina, from HSBC. Thank you.